Hello everyone, welcome back to The Last Climb. Today I'll be going over some of the dumbest Everest climbs where Gen Z thought they could conquer the highest peak in the world. From an arrogant TikToker who treated veteran Sherpas like a camera crew, not realizing they were about to film something devastating to a model who live-streamed her fatal ascent on TikTok. It was April 12th, 2023. Mount Everest sits on the border between Nepal and Tibet. The peak stands at 29,032 feet above sea level. That's over 5.5 miles straight up into the sky. The air at the summit has roughly a third of the oxygen you'd be breathing right now. Your brain starts shutting down. Your fingers and toes start dying. Your body is making a very loud, very clear argument for you to go back down. And the only way to survive is to listen. Every year, the Nepalese government issues a limited number of climbing permits. As of recent seasons, one permit runs about $11,000 per person, just for the right to attempt the climb. On top of that, you need a certified guide, the right equipment, oxygen systems, fees for base camp, fees for the icefall route, and all of it is tracked. Your name goes on a list. You get a permit tag that physically attaches to your oxygen bottles and your tent. Other climbers can see it. Expedition leaders can check it. Officials monitor radio communications. The system isn't perfect, but it exists because people die on this mountain, and the permits are part of how Nepal keeps some control over who goes up and whether they have any chance of coming back down. Yael Banavri, Saskia Patel, and May Aransibia did not have permits. They knew they didn't have permits. They planned the entire thing around the illegality of it. And somehow, incredibly, they thought that was fine. The three of them ran a joint travel account, one of those polished, heavily filtered feeds where every photo looks like it was shot for a luxury resort advertisement. Destinations in golden hour light, matching luggage, captions about authentic experiences and living with intention. They had enough followers to land small sponsorships, outdoor gear brands, a protein supplement company, a travel insurance service that I sincerely hope is cringing right now. Yael was the loudest one, both on camera and apparently in person. She had a way of turning every inconvenience into content and every obstacle into proof that the world was conspiring against creative women. She was the kind of person who described a delayed flight as a spiritual test and a bad hotel room as a character-building experience, always with that specific influencer cadence that makes everything sound like it's being narrated for an audience of people who need permission to feel inspired. Saskia was the one who handled the logistics, or what passed for logistics in their operation. May was quieter in the videos, but no less committed to the project. She had recently started posting more solo content, positioning herself as the adventure purist of the group, whatever that meant. Somewhere in the months before their Everest attempt, the three of them had landed on an idea. They were going to do what no women's team had done before, a fully independent, permit-free, unsupported ascent of Everest. They called it a historic all-female rogue ascent. They said it out loud, on camera, multiple times. They used the word rogue like it was a brand strategy, not a criminal description. They talked about sticking it to the gatekeepers of the climbing world, by which they seemed to mean anyone who had put in years of training and technical work and, yes, paid the legal fees to be there. The permit fee, Yael announced to her camera at one point, was just legalized robbery. Saskia laughed and said they had each saved over $10,000 by cutting the government out. May nodded and said the mountain didn't belong to anyone. The mountain, for the record, very much has a governing body, and it keeps records. To avoid the standard approach through the Khumbu Valley, a multi-day trek that virtually every Everest climber does both for acclimatization and because it's the required route, the three of them chartered a private helicopter and flew directly to the vicinity of base camp. The Khumbu Valley trek is about 38 miles over roughly 8 to 12 days. It's not optional. It's not just a scenic walk to enjoy the views. It's how your body starts adjusting to the altitude before you go anywhere near the dangerous parts. The gradual increase in elevation is what gives your blood time to produce more red blood cells, what lets your lungs learn to work harder, what keeps your brain functional enough to make decisions that might save your life. The women, however, thought the hike was for tourists. Yael said this on camera. She said it with genuine disdain. So they paid a helicopter operator, under the table, through a contact Saskia had apparently found through a third party, to drop them near base camp. No registration, no acclimatization days, no formal arrival process. But bypassing the permit system is far more than skipping a helicopter ride. Everest's Khumbu route is not an open hiking trail. It is heavily monitored expedition infrastructure. To climb without detection, they would have needed access through checkpoints staffed by officials who cross-reference permit lists, coordination with Sherpa logistics for carrying gear and setting camps, access to the icefall route, which requires knowledge of fixed rope timings and ladder installations, and an illegal oxygen supply chain, since every bottle of supplemental oxygen on the mountain is tracked by expedition operators. Simply landing near base camp does not grant entry to the upper mountain. The controlled flow of people and equipment makes a truly rogue ascent nearly impossible without inside help or months of covert planning. They landed, stepped out onto the glacier, and started filming immediately. The first sign came almost immediately. One of them, May, based on the footage that was later recovered, bent over and vomited within minutes of landing. She straightened up, looked at the camera, and made a face. Her hands were tingling, she said. She held them up like she was surprised by them. Her fingers looked pale. That tingling is your peripheral nervous system reacting to hypoxia, oxygen deprivation. At base camp, you're already sitting at around 17,600 feet. May's body, which had been at sea level less than a day earlier, was already starting to protest. The vomiting was altitude sickness. The tingling was her blood vessels constricting and her body struggling to figure out where all the oxygen had gone. Their guide, Nazir, saw May vomiting and hesitated. He knew dehydration was dangerous at altitude, but he also knew they had no privacy and limited water. In his cargo hauling days, porters often rationed water at night to avoid leaving the tent in the cold. He told her to drink a little less. A mistake born of habit, not malice, but a mistake nonetheless. I want you to sit with that for a second. A woman showing signs of altitude sickness, and the advice from the man responsible for their lives was to drink less water. Now, let's talk about Nazir. Nazir was not a climbing guide. He had never been a climbing guide. He worked as a cargo loader for trekking companies, carrying supplies, moving gear between camps, doing the unglamorous physical work that keeps the expedition economy running. He was good at his job. By all accounts, he was a reliable worker who knew the lower approaches of the mountain reasonably well from years of carrying loads. He was not qualified to guide clients up Everest. He had never used supplemental oxygen systems with clients before. He had never led anyone through the Khumbu icefall, which is the first and arguably most dangerous section of the standard route, a churning, shifting maze of ice towers called seracs, crevasses that drop hundreds of feet, and aluminum ladders lashed together across gaps that would kill you instantly if you fell. The icefall moves. It creaks and groans and collapses. There are windows of time each day when it's safer to cross, and windows of time when you do not cross if you have any sense. Experienced guides know these windows. They know the fixed rope procedures. They know how to read the ice. Nazir had crossed the icefall before, as a loader, never as a guide, and never responsible for keeping someone else alive while doing it. He took the job because he owed money, gambling debts according to people who knew him. The women were paying well, in cash, no paperwork. He needed it. The women knew all of this. This was not a case of someone being deceived about their guide's credentials. Yael, in footage that would eventually be recovered, waved off the concern explicitly. They didn't need some celebrity Sherpa babysitting them, she said. They were strong, capable women who had done their research. They had watched videos online. They had talked to people on forums. They were fine. At base camp, or rather, on the outskirts of base camp, since they couldn't register at the official camp without revealing that their names weren't on any permit list. The chaos started almost immediately. They had packed wrong. Not wrong in a minor way, not a forgotten luxury item, wrong in the way that gets people killed. They wandered into neighboring expedition camps asking to borrow stove fuel. They asked around for glove liners, the thin insulating layer you wear inside your main gloves. One of them needed crampon straps, the metal spikes that attach to your boots and are the difference between walking on ice and immediately dying on ice. These are not items you borrow. These are items you plan for. These are items that are on every single packing checklist for Everest, which are themselves freely available online in guidebooks, from any guide service from any gear retailer that sells high-altitude equipment. You don't forget crampon straps the way you forget to pack an extra pair of socks. You forget crampon straps because you are not taking this seriously. The expedition teams nearby watched all of this quietly. You have to understand the culture of high-altitude climbing. It's polite, it's cautious, people help each other when they're in trouble, but there's also a shared understanding that you don't meddle in other teams' business unless someone is about to die. People took note. People talked quietly among themselves. More than one experienced climber later said they noticed immediately that the three women had no permit tags anywhere visible, and that the man with them seemed unsure about basic procedures. No one said anything, not yet. While filming a sponsorship reel for one of her gear brands, one of the brands I'd like to note, whose products she apparently didn't know how to use, Saskia clipped her harness on backward. The harness is your connection to the safety ropes. It's what keeps you on the mountain if you slip. Clipping it backward compromises that completely. Nazir didn't catch it. Another climber passing nearby stopped and pointed it out. Saskia laughed it off on camera. She said something about how she was still warming up. They were at base camp. They hadn't started climbing yet. The night before they entered the ice fall, Nazir sat down with them, or so a nearby climber described it later, and tried to explain the ladder crossing technique. The icefall has sections where you cross crevasses on horizontal aluminum ladders lashed end to end, sometimes stretching 20 or 30 feet across open air over drops that vanish into darkness. You cross clipped into a safety line, moving carefully, one foot in front of the other, crampons balanced on the ladder rungs. It requires concentration and nerve, and the understanding that the rope you're clipped to will, at minimum, prevent you from falling free. Nazir had crossed the icefall dozens of times as a loader. He knew the ladder technique, but explaining it to frightened clients while his own nerves frayed was different. He stumbled over the details, forgot to mention how to handle the transition points, and gave vague answers about spacing. His knowledge was there, but his ability to teach it under pressure was failing. Yael asked if the safety line, the fixed rope that runs the entire route, was something they actually needed to be clipped into, or if it was just there as a psychological comfort for people who weren't confident. She was, based on everything I've read, completely serious. Nazir told her she should clip in. She filmed herself not clipping in at the first ladder. She walked across it freehand, looking at the camera, smiling. 20 feet below her, the crevasse disappeared into shadow. Inside the icefall, things got worse in ways that felt almost engineered. The icefall is not a place you linger. The entire philosophy of crossing it is speed with care. You move through the most dangerous sections efficiently because the longer you're in there, the more exposure you have to seracs collapsing, to ice shifting, to the general structural chaos of 2 billion tons of glacier doing what glaciers do. Experienced teams cross in the early morning hours before the day's warming destabilizes the ice. They move with purpose. They do not stop in exposed sections unless they have to. The women stopped constantly, not for safety checks, not to manage equipment, but to film. TikTok clips, short videos of themselves in the middle of the icefall with their helmets slightly askew and their pack straps not properly cinched. At one point, 2 of them removed their gloves entirely to retouch their makeup. The temperature was well below freezing, probably around -10 to -15 degrees Fahrenheit in the icefall section, and that's before accounting for wind. Frostbite on exposed fingers in those conditions can start in under 10 minutes. They touched up their foundation and put their gloves back on and kept filming. Then May dropped her phone. She was crossing a ladder, filming herself crossing a ladder, when the phone slipped from her hand and fell into the crevasse below. She immediately stopped, on the ladder, over the crevasse, and announced that they needed to stop because her phone was gone. She shone her headlamp down into the opening as though the phone might be visible somewhere in the dark. She debated out loud whether they could somehow retrieve it. Yael pointed out that it had a good camera on it and that they needed the footage. Nazir stood on the far side of the ladder and waited. They eventually moved on. The phone was gone. The climbers who passed them during this incident kept their opinions to themselves until they were safely out of earshot. They reached Camp Warren, which sits above the icefall at about 900 feet, in significantly worse shape than they should have been. That night, the cold went to work on what they didn't know. Proper storage of boot liners, the insulating inner layer that sits between your foot and the hard outer shell of a mountaineering boot, is one of the fundamentals of high-altitude camping. At night, you pull the liners out and sleep with them inside your sleeping bag, so body heat keeps them from freezing solid. If you leave them in the boots, they freeze, and in the morning, you are cramming your feet into frozen blocks of material. You cannot feel your feet, and feet you cannot feel at altitude are feet that are dying. None of them did this. Nobody had told them to, and apparently none of their online research had covered it. The next morning, one of the women, accounts suggest it was Saskia, reported that she couldn't feel several of her toes. The skin had started to go white and waxy, which is the first visible sign of frostbite. Real frostbite, not the light, reversible kind. The kind where tissue is beginning to die. Yael looked at it and told her it looked dramatic on camera. Nazir saw the white, waxy skin and his expression changed. He had seen frostbite before. Cargo porters sometimes got it on their hands. He knew it wasn't normal, but he later admitted that he knew they were too high to turn back easily, and he was overwhelmed by the responsibility. He told them it might be okay if they kept moving, hoping the descent would come soon. Camp 2 sits at roughly 21,300 feet, in the relatively flat section called the Western CWM, a wide glacial valley that funnels both climbers and wind with equal efficiency. By this point, they had been on the mountain for days without a single rest or acclimatization day. Their bodies were not adjusting because there was no time to adjust. Every morning, they pushed higher. Every morning, the oxygen thinned a little more. It was at Camp 2 that things nearly ended before they actually ended. An expedition leader from a commercial team, a man who had summited Everest 4 times and spent more than a decade leading guided ascents, noticed the 3 tents the women had set up. He noticed there were no permit tags, not on the tents, not on the oxygen bottles sitting outside. Every legal expedition has these. They're attached, visible, and checked. Their absence is not subtle. He walked over and asked politely who they were with and whether they could show their permits. The confrontation that followed was, by multiple witnesses' accounts, loud. Yael told him he was threatened by successful women. Saskia told him the permit system was corrupt and not everyone had the financial privilege to participate in institutional gatekeeping. May filmed it. The expedition leader kept his voice level and said he was simply asking to see documentation that every climber on this mountain was required to have. They packed up their camp and moved it in the dark to a location farther away, behind a ridge of ice where they were less visible from the main cluster of tents. This is the kind of decision you make when you are more worried about being caught than about being safe. Pitching camp in an unfamiliar section of a glacier at altitude in the dark is genuinely dangerous. But getting discovered was more dangerous to the project, so they moved. In the scramble to relocate, Nazir anchored one side of a tent platform incorrectly. The tent held, barely. But for the rest of that night, the women took turns physically holding the tent poles upright when wind gusts hit, because the anchor wasn't strong enough to keep the tent taut. They sat inside and held the poles, in the dark, at 21,000 feet. They also stopped doing radio check-ins around this time, which the expedition community had noticed. Legal teams do scheduled check-ins with base camp and with expedition operators. The check-ins are how people know you're alive. The women stopped doing theirs because they understood that communication logs were one of the ways officials tracked legal teams, and they couldn't afford to show up in any official record. By the time they reached Camp 3, which sits at around 23,600 feet on the Lhotse face, a nearly vertical wall of blue ice that climbers ascend using fixed ropes. The collective deterioration was obvious to anyone who saw them. May had been secretly taking Diamox, a medication sometimes used to help with altitude acclimatization symptoms. Diamox is a diuretic. It works by making you breathe faster, which increases the oxygen in your blood, but it also causes you to lose fluids rapidly. At altitude, where the dry air already dehydrates you faster than you realize, Diamox requires you to drink significantly more water to compensate. May was not doing this. She had taken the drug, felt briefly better, and interpreted that as license to keep going without paying attention to how much she was drinking. By Camp 3, she was severely dehydrated. Headache, dizziness, dark urine, the cognitive fog that comes when your blood thickens and your brain isn't getting what it needs. She didn't tell anyone this was happening. She filmed a short video from Camp 3 in which she talked about how incredible it felt to be above the clouds. Yael was vomiting again, not occasionally, regularly every few hours. She attributed it to the food. She had been vomiting periodically since the helicopter landing, and at no point had anyone connected the ongoing nausea to the fact that her body was giving a sustained, increasingly desperate signal that it was not okay. Saskia's toes were worse. Nobody mentioned it on camera anymore. The section above Camp 3, climbing toward the South Col, and then toward the balcony at around 27,600 feet, is where Everest sorts the prepared from the unprepared in a way that is final and unambiguous. Other climbers on the route, members of legal expeditions with experienced guides, proper equipment, acclimatization days, and functioning oxygen systems, began quietly passing the three women and Nazir, not because they were faster or fitter in some permanent sense, but because the women kept stopping for the wrong reasons and kept making mistakes that slowed everything down. Yael unclipped from the fixed rope multiple times so that drone footage would look unobstructed. The fixed rope on the upper mountain is not a suggestion. It is a physical connection between you and the mountain. That means if you slip, you stop falling after a few feet instead of continuing until you hit something hard enough to end you. She unclipped from it so her footage would look cleaner. Saskia kept forgetting to open her oxygen valve after rest stops. You stop, you sit down, you breathe, you rest, and when you stand up and start climbing again, you open the valve on your supplemental oxygen so that it flows. Saskia kept standing up and climbing without opening the valve. She would go several minutes at extreme altitude breathing nothing before she or someone else noticed the mask wasn't delivering anything. Each time this happened, it was a small additional insult to a brain that was already running on fumes. Nazir had handled oxygen bottles before. Cargo loads often included them. He knew how to read a pressure gauge. But at altitude, with 3 panicked clients, his ability to focus was fraying. He misread the gauges multiple times, confusing the working pressure with the remaining volume. It was the kind of mistake an exhausted, overwhelmed person makes, not a total novice. Experienced guides from other teams who passed them during this section said later that they considered reporting the group to officials. They discussed it. They were fairly certain these women were not legal, and they knew they were in serious trouble. Nobody made the call. Most of them assumed someone else would. Some of them thought the women were close enough to turning around that it might not matter. Some of them simply didn't want the complication. It's one of those things that's easy to understand in the moment and impossible to justify in retrospect. The women pushed through the night. There was no discussion about turning back. Yael had sold sponsored content tied to summit footage. The whole project was built on reaching the top and posting the video. Turning back meant losing sponsors. Turning back meant their followers would ask questions. Turning back meant the entire scheme. The fake expedition patches they had stolen from a dissolved climbing team and were wearing on their jackets to look legitimate. The bribed checkpoint workers, the deleted footage of them discussing fake identities, and their plan to avoid Nepalese climbing authorities would have been for nothing. So they climbed. And the mountain, which does not negotiate and does not care about follower counts or sponsorship deals or how much conviction you carry into its dead zones, was already deciding what came next. Near the balcony, in the dark, with temperatures somewhere around -40 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind picking up from the west, Nazir made the mistake that finished it. He was managing the remaining oxygen bottles, something he had done correctly on cargo loads, but never while hypoxic and sleep-deprived. He sorted them by feel, by weight, trusting his hands more than his fading vision. But at that altitude, his hands lied. He handed the women bottles that felt heavier, but were nearly empty, and kept one that felt lighter, but was full. He didn't know. The margin between life and death had shrunk to a misjudged weight. Yael lost consciousness first. She was clipped to the fixed rope when it happened, so she didn't fall. She just stopped moving, hanging against the line at 27,600 feet in the dark. May found her there. May stood next to her for a while, trying to rouse her, calling her name. Then May started talking about the sponsorships, about how they couldn't go back without the footage. She said this to Saskia, who was sitting in the snow nearby. She said she wasn't leaving Yoel because if they didn't have summit footage and something happened to Yael, it would look like they had abandoned her for views. Saskia, by this point, was not processing information normally. She was deep in the hypoxic fog that hits at extreme altitude when your oxygen is gone, and your brain is working on whatever residual supply remains in your bloodstream. The confusion comes first. then the hallucinations, then the certainty, which feels completely real and completely urgent, about things that are not happening. Saskia became certain that authorities were coming to arrest them. She said it out loud. She said it several times, with increasing panic. She unclipped from the fixed rope, to hide, presumably to get away from whoever was coming, and walked off the established route into the deep, untracked snow to the side of the path. She kept going. Nobody followed her. Nobody was able to. By morning, all three women were dead within a few hundred feet of each other on the upper mountain. Yael still hanging from the fixed line. Saskia somewhere in the snow to the side of the route. May collapsed near where she had last been standing. Nazir survived. He stumbled, nearly blind from snow exposure and hypoxia, into a camp belonging to a legal expedition lower on the mountain. They brought him down. He was frostbitten, confused, and alive. Nazir was arrested and faced charges related to illegal guiding and operating without a license. Nepalese authorities launched a wider investigation into the helicopter operator and the checkpoint workers who had been paid to look the other way. Several of the women's sponsors quietly removed any mention of the expedition from their websites and social media, though not before screenshots had circulated widely. It was April 14th, 2018. It started at the bottom of the mountain, where the warning signs were already piling up before she'd even laced her boots for the first real push. Her name was Davik Solano, 28 years old, blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Dave wasn't a random thrill seeker. She trained hard, and she had a small following online. She believed in herself deeply, maybe more deeply than anything else, and that belief slowly poisoned her Everest attempt. Davy had built a decent online following over the previous 2 years. Her content was the kind that did well in that era. Cold plunges at 5 in the morning, mat footage from her jiu-jitsu gym, captions about discipline and mental toughness. She'd earned her blue belt about 8 months before the expedition, and friends said that she treated it like a doctorate. It was the centerpiece of her identity, the proof that she wasn't soft. I think what she wasn't, though, was a mountaineer. At base camp, the difference between someone with climbing experience and someone without it isn't always obvious at first. I've heard people move around, set up gear, joke with each other. It looks social, but the Sherpas assigned to the expedition, the men who had been on this mountain more times than most people change jobs, they noticed things quickly. Apparently, I've read based on their accounts that Dave moved inefficiently. She burned energy on flat terrain the way most people burn it, going uphill. Her breathing was already labored at an elevation where it should have been manageable with basic pacing. Renzin, the lead Sherpa on her team, watched her during the first acclimatization walk and said nothing yet. He said that he'd seen enough to know that early advice to someone like her rarely landed well. She beat him to it anyway. She explicitly told him that she knows how her body works after he slowed the group's pace. She said that she's done breathwork and ice baths, and that she's not fragile. Renzin nodded and said nothing. The mountain hadn't even started yet. Moving from base camp to Camp 1 sounds straightforward on paper. In reality, it runs through the Khumbu Icefall, one of the most unpredictable sections of the entire climb. Towers of ice the size of office buildings shift without warning. Climbers cross crevasses on aluminum ladders held together with rope and hope. Most experienced mountaineers move through it fast and quiet, conserving everything. Davig moved through it like she was proving something. She pushed ahead of the group's established pace twice. She talked during rest stops instead of recovering. By the time they reached Camp 1, she was visibly winded in a way that went beyond normal exertion. Other climbers on the expedition, among them a Norwegian named Tor and a quietly experienced woman from Colorado named Brekka, said that they exchanged glances but kept their thoughts to themselves. I do think they should have at least raised the concern, but I understand that it wasn't their place. What was striking, multiple climbers later recalled, wasn't just that Davy was struggling, it was the explanation she gave for the struggle. She had started connecting her cold exposure training to altitude resistance. The logic, as she laid it out to anyone who would listen over dinner at Camp 1, was that her body had already been conditioned to perform under physical stress. Ice baths trained mental fortitude. Jiu-jitsu trained her to stay calm when her body was screaming. Therefore, altitude sickness was, in her words, just another mental barrier trying to get in the way. Tor later described sitting across from her during that conversation and feeling genuinely unsettled, not because the idea was offensive, but because she believed it completely. Renzin heard the same speech secondhand and recognized it immediately. He said that he had guided enough climbers to know the difference between someone who was nervous and masking it and someone who had genuinely replaced information with ideology. Davi was the second kind. I believe that the more uncomfortable she felt on the mountain, the harder. She leaned into the framework she'd brought with her from sea level. I think the climb wasn't a survival process for her anymore. It was a personal statement, and personal statements on Everest have a very poor survival rate. The push toward Camp 2 was where things stopped being uncomfortable and started being serious. Renzin called a pace check about 2 hours into the climb. Standard procedure: read the group, read the conditions, adjust accordingly. He had been watching Dave's movement patterns for days at that point, and what he saw concerned him enough to say something directly. Her recovery time between steps had lengthened. She was planting her feet with less precision than she had even 2 days earlier. He pulled her aside, kept his voice level, and told her the group needed to consider slowing down or making a short rotation back to base camp to allow her body more time to adjust. She apparently didn't take it well. What followed was loud enough that Tor and Brekka both heard it clearly from 20 feet away. Davi didn't just push back, she reframed the entire conversation. She told Renzin that she knew exactly what he was doing, that men in these environments always found a way to question women's physical capability, that she had trained harder than half the people on this mountain, and she wasn't going to be managed. Renzin didn't raise his voice. He repeated his assessment calmly and said the recommendation stood. She told him, in fairly direct language, where he could put that recommendation. The group absorbed this in silence. Brekka later described the atmosphere as immediately changed. Not tense exactly, but altered. The kind of shift that happens when a dynamic that everyone had been quietly tolerating suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. What made it worse was the specifics of what she refused. Renzin hadn't been asking her to quit. He'd suggested supplemental oxygen planning for the upper sections and a modified pacing schedule, both of which are standard, both of which experienced climbers accept without drama. Dave treated them like personal attacks. I want to pause here for a second, because this is the moment the story turns. Up to this point, Dave had been difficult, overconfident, and stubborn. Those things are frustrating, but they're not automatically fatal. What changed at Camp 2's approach was that she stopped engaging with the mountain entirely and started treating every piece of guidance as an obstacle to her narrative. Everest doesn't care about narratives. It doesn't negotiate with them. It doesn't reward them. This pattern, overconfidence dressed up as resilience, stubbornness reframed as strength, shows up in a significant number of Everest fatalities. The mountain didn't beat those people. Their own refusal to adapt did. The weather on Everest doesn't announce itself politely. It doesn't build gradually the way a storm does at lower elevations, where you get clouds first, then wind, then rain in a sequence you can prepare for. Up here, conditions tightened fast. The temperature dropped sharply overnight between April 26th and 27th, and by morning, the wind had picked up enough that movement required deliberate effort just to stay balanced. It wasn't a storm, not technically, but it was the mountain applying pressure, the way it does when it's testing who belongs there and who doesn't. Davi's body had already been giving answers to that question for days. Now, it started giving them louder. Tor noticed it first during the morning's movement out of Camp 2. Davi's reaction time had slowed in a way that went beyond tiredness. When Renzin called out a route adjustment, most climbers processed it and shifted within a few seconds. Davy took noticeably longer. Not dramatically, but enough. Her coordination had softened. She was placing her feet with less confidence, occasionally overcorrecting her balance on terrain that shouldn't have required it. Her breathing had become labored in a new way too. At base camp, it had been inefficient. Now it was heavy and audible even through the wind, which at that altitude, in those conditions, was not a good sign. And yet she pushed harder. That detail is the one that stuck with everyone who was there. The logical response to a body that is visibly struggling at altitude is to slow down, conserve oxygen, reduce output. Every piece of mountaineering knowledge points in that direction. Dave did the opposite. When she felt herself slowing, she forced more effort. When her breathing got worse, she tried to outpace it. Renzin and the other Sherpas had moved into a quieter mode of observation by this point. They discussed her condition among themselves that evening at Camp 2. The conversation, by multiple accounts, was not optimistic. They weren't being callous. They were being accurate. They had seen this trajectory before, and they knew where it typically ended. What they couldn't do, what no Sherpa can ultimately do, was physically force a paying client to stop. They could advise, they could warn, they could make the case as clearly and as many times as the situation allowed. Davy had already made clear how much that was worth to her. Altitude sickness doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait until you're ready, and it doesn't care how disciplined your morning routine is. At a certain point, the human body at extreme elevation begins to break down in ways that are well documented, well understood, and, critically, well recognized by anyone with actual experience on high mountains. The symptoms have a pattern. They follow a sequence, and that sequence, if ignored long enough, becomes irreversible. Davy hit the first clear markers somewhere between Camp 2 and the approach to Camp 3. The headaches came first. She mentioned them in passing, dismissively, the way someone mentions a minor inconvenience. Brecca heard her describe one as just pressure, and watched her take a painkiller and keep moving. Then came the nausea, quieter, less visible, but Tor noticed she had barely touched her food during the last rest stop, which for someone who had been loudly enthusiastic about her nutrition habits since base camp was a shift worth noting. The confusion was the one that scared people. It didn't present dramatically. It wasn't like watching someone lose their mind in real time. It was subtler than that. Small delays in comprehension, responses that were slightly off from what had been said to her, a blankness behind the eyes that came and went. Renzin asked her a direct logistical question about her oxygen supply during a rest stop, and she answered something that didn't quite connect to what he'd asked. He repeated himself. She corrected, irritated, and moved on. What she said about all of it was the part that stayed with the other climbers long after the expedition ended, and even for me. She reframed every symptom out loud. The headaches were her body detoxing from lower elevation comfort. The nausea was resistance trying to talk her out of something great. The confusion, which she either didn't recognize or refused to acknowledge fully, got folded into a brief, slightly rambling speech she gave to no one in particular during a rest stop. Something about how the mind always tried to manufacture exits right before a breakthrough. Brecca said it was one of the more unsettling things she'd witnessed on a mountain, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so completely disconnected from reality. Multiple climbers urged her to descend that afternoon. Not Renzin this time, other members of the group, people who had no authority over her and no agenda, just genuine alarm at what they were watching. She thanked them with a tone that made clear she found the concern patronizing and kept climbing. The symptoms didn't go away. They compounded. Camp 3 on Mount Everest is a narrow ledge carved into the Lhotse face, where tents cling to ice because nothing is flat. Oxygen is cut roughly in half, turning every breath shallow and every movement expensive. At that altitude, the body isn't adapting. It's slowly failing. Renzin chose this moment for a second, more direct conversation. He didn't ease into it this time. He told Davy plainly that her symptoms were consistent with acute mountain sickness, progressing towards something more dangerous. He told her that continuing upward without a mandatory rest rotation and proper oxygen management wasn't bravery. It was a medical risk that he was no longer comfortable guiding around. He told her the recommendation was descent and that it was firm. Davy's response was immediate and loud enough that it carried through the thin walls of the adjacent tent where Tor was resting. She screamed at Renzin that turning back was failure, plain and simple, and that she hadn't come this far to fail. He said that she mentioned the word quitter more than once, directed at the concept of descending, but landing on Renzin like an accusation. Then she shifted, the way she had before, into the gender framing. She told him, and the two other Sherpas present, that it was telling how the pushback always seemed to intensify the closer she got to proving something, that the men around her had been waiting for a reason to pull her back since base camp. Renzin, by every account, remained completely calm. That calm seemed to infuriate her more than an argument would have. The group dynamic had been straining for days. After this confrontation, it fractured. Tor made a quiet decision to increase his distance from her during movement. Brecca stopped trying to engage her in conversation entirely. Other climbers on the expedition began routing their rest stops to avoid overlapping with hers. It wasn't coordinated, it was instinctive. The kind of collective withdrawal that happens when a group recognizes that proximity to someone's choices has started to carry its own risk. Daveg either didn't notice or didn't care. She repacked her gear after the confrontation with sharp, deliberate movements and announced to no one in particular that she was continuing in the morning. Nobody argued, there was nothing left to argue with. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a group when everyone has accepted an outcome that hasn't happened yet. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just a quiet shift in the way people move around each other, the way conversations get shorter, the way eyes stop meeting across a rest stop. By the morning of May 2nd, that silence had probably settled firmly over everyone in proximity to Davy Solano. She was stumbling, not constantly, not in a way that looked like a fall waiting to happen every single step, but enough. I've read based on other climbers' accounts that her boots were catching on terrain that didn't warrant it. She was overcorrecting her balance on flat sections of the fixed rope, grabbing it for stability where experienced climbers let their hands rest loosely. Tor, moving ahead of her by about 30 feet, slowed his pace twice without being asked. Not to help her, but because watching her from that distance made him nervous in a way he couldn't fully justify yet, but couldn't ignore either. Her speech had deteriorated. No more speeches, just delayed, mismatched replies. When asked how she felt, she muttered about the rope instead. By then, the Sherpas had already stopped intervening. They'd offered everything, repeatedly, and she'd refused every time. With the group's safety on the line, they made the unspoken call to let her choices stand. They kept her in sight. They stayed close enough to respond if the situation became acute, but the active intervention phase had ended. Dave kept moving upward, slower now and more mechanical. Each step looked like a separate decision rather than part of a continuous motion. The mountain above her was getting no easier, and her body had long since stopped having anything extra to give it. There was no turning point. That's the thing about this stage of a decline like this. There's no single moment where everything changes. It had already changed. It had been changing for days. What was happening now was just the visible end of a process that started the moment she decided the mountain was something she could argue with. The death zone isn't metaphor. It's a threshold above 26,000 feet on Mount Everest, where the body can't acclimatize. Oxygen is so low that survival isn't adaptation, it's decay. Every minute there is the body burning itself just to keep moving, and the only thing that changes is how quickly it breaks down. Davy crossed that threshold on the morning of May 3rd. I think she shouldn't have been there, not because of any rule or regulation, but because her body had been broadcasting for days that it had already reached its limit several thousand feet below. What was happening to her now wasn't a new problem. It was the same problem, in a place where the consequences of ignoring it had become completely irreversible. Her movement had degraded to barely recognizable progress on Mount Everest, described by one climber as walking through wet concrete. Each step looked manually assembled, arms hanging forward in a way that signaled the body was conserving every last bit of energy. Her oxygen use had also become unstable. Irregular tank management, a poorly sealed mask flagged days earlier by Sherpas, and corrections dismissed outright. She was offered help twice during the approach to that elevation, once by a Sherpa who fell into step beside her and quietly suggested she switch to a higher flow rate on her oxygen system, once by a climber from a separate expedition who recognized distress and offered to radio for a descent team. She declined both, the first with a short shake of her head, the second with a look that the climber later described as somewhere between exhausted and offended. And yet, she kept moving, slower than before, more alone than before. The group had naturally spread around her in a way that left her increasingly isolated within the column. Not abandoned, but separate. The mountain above was indifferent to the distance she had already covered. It didn't award credit for effort spent. It only registered what was happening right now. And what was happening right now was a body at its absolute end trying to go further. Now, I have to be honest. The accounts from this section of Mount Everest are consistent to the point of discomfort, differing only in angle, not outcome. What they describe isn't a sudden emergency, but a slow, visible breakdown that everyone saw coming and no one could interrupt. Tor was the first to document her sitting down. It was at a section of fixed rope where the standard practice was to clip in, rest briefly if needed, and continue moving. Davy sat, not a crouch, not a lean. She sat fully, on the snow, with her back against the slope and her legs extended in front of her. Tor waited. After several minutes, she hadn't moved. He called out to her. She turned her head toward him slowly, and he said later that the delay between his voice and her reaction was long enough to be alarming. She stood eventually. It took her 3 attempts. Brecca passed her about 40 minutes later and described something similar. Dave was stopped again, this time without even the pretense of a rest clip. She was simply standing still on the rope, staring upward, not moving. Brecca spoke to her directly, asked if she needed help descending. Dave's response was quiet, slower than normal speech, and largely incoherent. Something about not stopping, something about proving it. Brecca couldn't make full sense of it. She stayed for a few minutes, then had to move on. A climber from a South Korean expedition reported seeing her sitting a third time, roughly an hour after Brecca's account. By this point, she was barely responding to direct questions. He described asking her name and watching her look at him for a long moment before answering, as though the question required translation. Renzin reached her shortly after and made what he later described as the final formal attempt at intervention. He told her clearly and slowly that she needed to descend immediately, that the team would assist her, that there was still a window to get her down safely if they moved now. He said she looked at him for a long time after he finished speaking. Then she said quietly that going back was for the weak people, and that was more or less the last coherent thing anyone heard from her. I'll say this plainly. This is the moment that survival required cooperation, and cooperation never came. Everest is full of stories that could have ended differently at exactly this kind of juncture. The help was there, the window was there, the people willing to assist were standing right next to her. What wasn't there was any willingness on her part to accept that the mountain had already won. She stopped moving entirely sometime in the mid-afternoon. There was no dramatic moment, no final words that crystallized everything, no last gesture that meant something. She simply reached a point where her body had nothing left to execute the next step, and she sat down in the snow and she didn't get back up. The mountain didn't do anything special to mark the occasion. The wind kept moving, the temperature kept dropping. Everything continued exactly as it had been. Hypoxia at that stage doesn't look like the movies. It doesn't look like agony. The brain, starved of oxygen for long enough, stops generating distress signals with any urgency. What it looks like from the outside is stillness. A person sitting quietly, eyes open sometimes, breathing for a while, present in the most technical sense of the word, and completely unreachable in every sense that matters. Tore past her position and stopped. He stayed for several minutes, spoke to her, got no response that indicated comprehension. He was carrying his own survival calculus by that point. Every climber in the death zone is, and he made the decision that every climber in that situation eventually has to make. He moved on. Renzin made one final attempt. He crouched beside her, spoke her name, tried to get a response that he could work with. There was nothing usable. He later said he stayed as long as he could justify staying, given his responsibility to the other climbers in his care. Then he stood, looked at her for a moment, and continued down. Other climbers from separate expeditions passed her over the following hours. Several stopped. None could do more than the people who had already tried. Her body was later confirmed dead at that position. She never made it close to the summit. She was still in the early reaches of the death zone when she stopped, thousands of feet below the top, well short of the upper sections she had talked about with such certainty at base camp. I believe that the mountain she had described as a mental barrier, a test of personal resolve, a stage for proving something to herself and whoever was watching. That mountain hadn't even shown her its most difficult sections. It was May 18, 2019, above 16,400 feet in the Khumbu Valley. The air held a stillness where sound faded quickly, voices flattened, and even footsteps on rock seemed to disappear before they finished. Light arrived before heat at this altitude, and on most days, warmth never fully followed. Ryan Cardama was 23, from central Texas, where the highest nearby elevation reached about 1,800 feet. He worked in warehouse logistics, structured, routine-driven work, and had framed the Nepal trip to coworkers almost entirely around the footage he expected to capture: glaciers, ridgelines, and light across snowfields rather than the demands of sustained altitude. Derek Sargent, 22, from California's Central Valley, handled the group's technical side: cameras, lenses, storage, and workflow. He was precise with what he knew, but less aware of what he didn't. He spent time reviewing shot lists before the trip. The acclimatization guidelines in the same folder received less attention. That detail stopped me cold when I found it. Marcus Chervy, 24, from the Tampa Bay area, positioned himself as the group's most experienced outdoorsman. He had completed multi-day hikes in the American Southeast and maintained strong physical fitness, but had no meaningful exposure to elevations above 10,000 feet. The Smoky Mountains top out around 6,600 feet, an elevation that does not prepare the body for the 16,000-foot conditions of the Khumbu. The difference is fundamental, not gradual, and confidence built at lower altitude does not transfer. As expected, I've covered enough of these stories to know that confidence is almost always the first thing that gets people into trouble. Not recklessness, just misplaced confidence. The three had connected through the online outdoor content space, building a modest audience around accessible, visually driven trekking videos, where relatability, not technical expertise, was the focus. Nepal had been planned for 8 months around shot lists, gear, and posting schedules, with little emphasis on acclimatization. The Everest base camp route was treated as manageable by default, even though adaptation to altitude, not fitness, is what determines most outcomes on this trail. Pre-departure materials outlined these risks, but they were not treated as a central constraint in planning. The flight to Lukla at 9,380 feet marked an immediate shift into an environment the body was not yet prepared for. The group spent one night in Lukla before beginning the approach toward Namche Bazar, the primary hub village of the Khumbu region, situated at approximately 11,286 feet. This remained within standard expedition planning, but already reflected the faster end of typical acclimatization, pacing for arrivals from low elevation. This was still within normal expedition planning, but already at the faster end of standard acclimatization, pacing for arrivals from low elevation. The walk from Lukla to Namche takes most trekking groups 2 days, with the second day involving a sustained climb of roughly 2,600 feet, the first significant physical test of the route. The Sherpa guides assigned to the group by the trekking operator were experienced. On this route, guides are not there to introduce technical difficulty, but to manage risk that emerges from physiology and decision-making rather than terrain alone. Between them, they had accumulated years of work on the Khumbu routes, including multiple seasons supporting commercial trekking groups of varying fitness, levels, and preparation quality. They were not technical mountaineers leading rope descents of difficult peaks. The Everest base camp route does not require that, but they were deeply familiar with the terrain, the weather patterns, the physiological warning signs that altitude produces in unacclimatized trekkers, and the behavioral patterns that tend to precede problems. I've seen how that familiarity shows up early in the way groups move through the lower sections of a route. Within the first day of walking, they had begun to form an assessment of the group. The assessment was not alarming at that stage. It was observational. The three young men were fit enough to move at a reasonable pace on the lower sections of trail. They were enthusiastic, which was common. They stopped frequently to film, a pattern common among content-focused trekkers that had grown substantially in recent years. What the guides noted was that these stops were not functioning as recovery. They involved repositioning, equipment adjustments, and reviewing footage on small screens before movement resumed. Each interruption served the content rather than physiological rest, and the pattern did not change as elevation increased. What was less visible to the group, and rarely explained in detail in standard briefing materials, was the decision threshold that guides use to determine when observation becomes intervention. On paper, acclimatization schedules and pacing plans exist as structured guidelines. In practice, Sherpa guides operate on a continuum of escalation rather than a single trigger point. There is no single symptom, stop, or missed meal that automatically forces a group to halt. Instead, decisions are based on whether multiple small deviations begin to converge into a sustained pattern of physiological and behavioral decline. The first threshold is usually operational drift, pace slowing beyond itinerary expectations, or repeated compression of rest intervals that begins to alter the planned timing between villages. At this stage, the default response is still verbal correction, reminders about hydration, spacing, and tempo, because early drift is common and often reversible. I've seen this stage play out often enough to recognize how unremarkable it looks in the moment. Nothing feels wrong, even as the structure of the day quietly starts to loosen. The second threshold is accumulation without correction, where issues like inconsistent intake, delayed arrivals, and repeated pauses begin reinforcing each other rather than appearing isolated. At this stage, guides typically move from reminders to more explicit instruction, adjusting spacing or adding enforced rest, without fully stopping progress. A full intervention, such as slowing the itinerary or holding a group in place, is reserved for when physiological signs align with behavioral drift, including persistent headaches, coordination changes, or cognitive lapses, affecting basic judgment. In this case, the guides remained in the middle range of that spectrum, as the concerns, slower timing, reduced intake, intermittent confusion, still had plausible altitude-related explanations and had not yet reached the threshold for overriding the itinerary. Guides are rarely responding to a single clear indicator. They are interpreting clusters of behavior that only gain meaning once they begin to persist over time. So, the situation remained in a managed state, corrected, monitored, and noted, but not escalated. In my view, I'm not looking at any one signal in isolation. I'm tracking patterns, small shifts in pace, intake, attention, and watching how they repeat, overlap, and reinforce each other until they stop behaving like coincidence and start forming something more consistent. The gap between observation and intervention in this kind of environment is rarely about awareness. It is about how long a pattern can remain ambiguous before it becomes operationally undeniable. And by the time ambiguity resolves into certainty at altitude, the available margin for correction is often already reduced. Hydration and nutrition followed the same structure, inconsistent intake that never fully adjusted as altitude increased. The guides raised concerns early, but while the issue was acknowledged, it did not translate into sustained behavioral change. The shortfall accumulated steadily as exertion increased and oxygen availability decreased. Namche Bazaar sits in a natural amphitheater carved into the hillside above the Dudkoshi River Valley. Its buildings arranged in a rough semicircle that faces south and catches afternoon sun. It is a busy place by Khumbu standards, a hub for trekking logistics, equipment rental, food resupply, and informal information exchange between groups moving through the same narrow corridor toward the higher route. The tea houses in Namche are warmer and better supplied than those higher on the route. The altitude is significant but not yet severe, and most trekkers who will encounter problems further up still feel in Namche that they are managing well. The standard acclimatization protocol at Namche calls for a rest day, or more precisely, an acclimatization day, during which trekkers are encouraged to make a short ascent to a higher elevation, and then return to sleep at Namche's altitude. The physiological principle behind this is well established. The body adapts more effectively when exposed to higher elevations during the day and allowed to recover at a lower sleeping elevation at night. It's one of those rules that sounds straightforward until you're actually there, because it quietly depends on patience more than effort. The phrase used in most trekking literature is climb high, sleep low. It is simple, widely applied, and depends on time that does not contribute to forward progress. The group spent the required time in Namche. The trekking operator's itinerary included the acclimatization day, but it was not used in the way the protocol intended. They completed the short ascent as required, but most of the remaining time was spent around the tea house area reviewing footage, organizing files, and continuing the same content workflow that had defined the journey from the start. The movement intended to stimulate adaptation was completed, but recovery, rest, hydration, and reduced exertion remained secondary rather than central. Forward progress was achieved. Full acclimatization was not. The guidance was understood clearly at every stage. The issue was not recognition, but consistency in implementation. Recommendations were acknowledged, but not translated into sustained behavioral change. At sea level, that gap is minor. At altitude, it becomes consequential. From that point forward, the route stopped behaving as a sequence of independent decisions and instead followed an established pattern. Under increasing physiological stress, each stage did not introduce entirely new failures so much as amplify conditions already in place. Above Namche, the route passes through a series of villages, Tengboche, Dingboche, Lobuche, each at progressively higher elevation, each requiring its own adjustment period, each offering familiar warning signs to those who know how to read them. The landscape changes in character, vegetation thins and disappears. The trail moves into moraine fields. Accumulated debris of glacial movement, loose rock, gravel, and occasional large boulders deposited without order across the terrain. This is where the route stops feeling like a trail in the conventional sense and starts behaving more like an environment that must be continuously interpreted rather than simply walked through. The paths are well marked by the standards of high-altitude trekking, but they are not engineered in the way that lower elevation trails are. They follow the terrain rather than shaping it. They require attention. Here, I've learned that clear doesn't always mean easy to follow, especially when the ground itself is uneven enough that every step still has to be actively chosen. The group moved through this section over several days at a pace that, by distance alone, appeared consistent with the itinerary, but distance was not the limiting factor. Altitude response depends on time, fuel, hydration, and cumulative stress. and on all of those measures, the group was gradually falling behind. One detail the guides later emphasized was that the group's daily timing began to drift despite leaving on schedule. Above 13,000 feet, they were arriving later than expected with increasing consistency. The explanation wasn't a single factor. It was the accumulation of unregistered interruptions, short gear adjustments that turned into recovery pauses, breath breaks that lengthened slightly without being classified as rest, and repeated stops that were not treated as deviations. Over time, these fragments did not change the route on paper, but they steadily reduced how much uninterrupted movement the body was actually performing each day. The headaches began above 13,000 feet, which is not unusual at that elevation. Mild headache is among the earliest responses to reduced oxygen availability, and in isolation, it does not signal acute danger. The standard response is hydration, rest, and monitoring for escalation. In this case, the symptoms were treated as background discomfort rather than a condition requiring adjustment to pace or behavior. They continued filming through them, sometimes referencing the headache directly on camera without altering the structure of the day. That distinction becomes critical. Symptoms that are not acted on stop functioning as signals. Cognitive strain began to show in repetition rather than confusion. The same information, trail direction, distance, orientation, would be requested. Again after short intervals, not out of disagreement, but because it did not retain long enough under exertion to carry forward. Guides would provide clarification, movement would resume, and then the same questions would reappear in slightly altered form. It wasn't disorientation in the overt sense, but a narrowing of working certainty, where previously stable information required repeated confirmation. Cardama mentioned his headache in a short clip, filmed somewhere above Tengboche, framing it as part of the experience and evidence of the challenge they were undertaking. The clip was uploaded that evening. That detail stood out more than most. The appetite suppression that accompanies altitude exposure is also well documented, and begins to affect most trekkers somewhere in the 12,000 to 14,000 foot range. The body, under hypoxic stress, redirects resources in ways that reduce the sensation of hunger, even as caloric demand increases. The result is a physiological trap. The body needs more fuel precisely when it is least inclined to seek it. Managing this requires deliberate, scheduled eating, consuming food at regular intervals regardless of hunger signals, prioritizing calorie-dense intake, and treating nutrition as a functional requirement rather than a response to appetite. The group's eating pattern was not structured in this way from the beginning of the trek, and it did not become more structured as altitude increased. Meals were sometimes skipped for early departures, and snack intake remained inconsistent throughout the route. The caloric deficit did not appear dramatic on any single day, but it accumulated steadily as altitude increased and exertion demands grew. The guides raised the concern and saw only minor adjustment in response, with behavior largely unchanged through the upper sections of the trek. Their role was advisory rather than supervisory, and while the issue was clearly communicated, there was no mechanism to enforce compliance. What stands out in hindsight is how often acknowledgement gets mistaken for action. They did not ignore the guidance, they simply never fully reorganized their behavior around it. At sea level, that gap is usually harmless. At altitude, it compounds. Coordination changes at altitude are subtle in their early stages. Slightly delayed steps, reduced responsiveness to pacing signals, and less precise movement over uneven terrain. Above 14,000 feet, these shifts remained individually explainable, which made the broader pattern difficult to recognize in real time. The group continued on the momentum of its plan rather than adjusting to what the conditions were progressively showing. I keep returning to that idea, not because it describes a single mistake, but because it describes how decisions behave when nothing forces them to change. Beyond Dingboche and toward Lobouche, the pattern continued without meaningful adjustment. The terrain grew more complex, wider. Moraine fields, narrower paths, and unstable surfaces where gravel often concealed underlying ice. Sections that appeared straightforward required constant attention, with sudden transitions and reduced margin for error. On May 18th, under typical pre-monsoon conditions, temperatures in the upper 20s to 30s, Fahrenheit and steady wind across exposed ridges, the group departed before 6 in the morning, maintaining the same filming-driven pace that had defined the trek from the start, capturing footage during the hours when the sun was low and the shadows were long. Breakfast on the morning of May 18th was minimal, according to tea house staff. Another small decision that, in isolation, would not matter, but at altitude rarely exists in isolation for long. Fixed ropes were installed along this traverse, anchored at intervals to provide balance and stability. They were not designed to stop a full fall, but to assist controlled movement, something manageable under normal conditions, but far less reliable for someone already physically and cognitively compromised. For a person in compromised physical condition, dehydrated, calorically depleted, operating under the cognitive effects of sustained hypoxic exposure, the same crossing requires something the body may no longer be fully able to provide. The group reached the narrow traverse section in the mid-morning. The guides were positioned in the standard configuration for a rope-assisted crossing, one ahead of the group to demonstrate the line and monitor the anchor points, one behind to observe and assist. The guides later described the group's movement in the approach to the traverse as showing the characteristics they had been observing for several days in more pronounced form. Foot placement was less deliberate than it had been in the lower sections of the route. Response to verbal pacing signals was slower than it should have been. The rhythm of movement that experienced trekkers develop on technical terrain was inconsistent. None of this was, at the moment of observation, a definitive indicator that something was about to go wrong. It was a collection of small signals, each individually explainable, that together formed a pattern the guides recognized. By the approach to the traverse, the same concerns had already been raised multiple times without meaningful behavioral change. It wasn't any single mistake that stood out. It was how familiar the whole pattern already felt once it started repeating in slightly different forms. The sequence of events that followed was reconstructed from the accounts of the Sherpa guides and from the physical evidence of the terrain. It unfolded over a period of seconds. One member of the group made an adjustment to the camera equipment being carried during the crossing. The adjustment involved a shift in body position at a point on the traverse where the trail surface was narrowest, and the fixed rope required steady, consistent tension to function as intended. The shift in position moved weight distribution away from the optimal center of gravity alignment that the crossing required. The foot that bore the redistributed weight came down on a section of trail surface where loose gravel overlaid a thin ice crust. The gravel, under the change weight distribution, shifted. Everything that came before, every skipped meal, every filming pause, every ignored recommendation, it all converged in that 1 second. The ice beneath it offered no friction. The foot moved. The fixed rope arrested the initial movement, but the arrest transferred load along the rope system, and the load transfer reached the other members of the group who were on the line at the same moment. In hypoxic conditions, with compromised reaction time and reduced balance correction ability, the response to an unexpected load transfer on a fixed line requires a speed and precision of physical response that the body, under the conditions the group had been operating in for the preceding days, could not reliably produce. The second loss of footing followed within seconds of the first. The third followed the second. At that point, what stands out to me isn't just how fast it unfolded, but how little room there actually is for correction once the system is already under strain. The guides moved immediately, but the terrain below the traverse did not allow a clean arrest once movement began. The same gravel over ice surface that triggered the slip extended into the section where counterforce would have been needed, and the speed of the sequence exceeded what could be physically stopped. What followed wasn't a single fall, but a broken descent across staggered ledges, compacted ice, and loose rock, breaking the movement into uneven stages, forcing separation as each person followed a different line through the terrain. The guides pushed down after them at once, but the same ground conditions that prevented control from above also slowed any attempt to close the distance from below. A separate trekking party on a parallel section of the route heard the disturbance and altered course. By the time the guides reached the first member of the group, approximately 12 minutes had passed since the initial slip. Ground response was initiated within minutes by the Sherpa guides and nearby trekking personnel. The trekking operator's emergency contact in Kathmandu was notified that same afternoon. Helicopter evacuation was requested but could not be executed on May 18th due to deteriorating weather and the altitude limitations affecting rotary wing operations in the upper Khumbu. Initial access and recovery were carried out on foot, with helicopter support arriving the following morning once conditions improved. Post-recovery medical assessment documented trauma consistent with multi-stage descent impacts across broken terrain at high altitude. along with acute altitude-related illness in all three individuals, significant dehydration, and caloric depletion consistent with sustained exertion without adequate intake. What the medical language does not fully capture is that each of these findings reflects a condition that developed in real time under observable circumstances with known risks already present. The official review identified physiological decline driven by inadequate hydration, insufficient caloric intake, and cumulative hypoxic exposure above 16,000 feet as a primary factor contributing to impaired coordination and delayed reaction time during the rope-assisted traverse. All three members of the group, Ryan Cardama, Derek Sargent, and Marcus Chervy, died from injuries sustained in the fall. It was May 21st, 2017, on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest at roughly 28,000 feet, in a season that had packed dozens of climbers into the same narrow summit window. Alina Popa was 26 and worked part-time at a coffee shop in Bucharest, spending 2 years posting budget travel content to TikTok, averaging a few thousand views per clip. Everest was her breakout investment, most of her savings committed to the expedition. Physically, she had trained, and her prior guided summits included Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua. Her previous teammates described her as quiet but stubborn, compliant under supervision, inclined to cut corners when she felt she'd earned it. For me, it seemed like her goal wasn't just the summit. It was capturing the moment raw, which was her undoing. Filming above the balcony wasn't reckless in isolation. The fixed lines had become congested by early morning. Climbers queued in slow, frustrating increments. I think that for someone whose entire purpose on the mountain was documentation, standing still while her phone went unused was a genuine pressure. She filmed the delays, filmed other climbers, and periodically removed her oxygen mask to narrate in short, broken clips into the camera, reseating it each time with visible fumbling through her gloves, but never long enough for the regulator to fully stabilize. Near 28,000 feet, she unclipped from the fixed line to step around a cluster of stopped climbers, moving into deeper and uneven snow for a wider angle. Her Sherpa had instructed her to stay clipped at all times. She stayed off the line longer than he intended. Her oxygen flow rate had already been raised to offset exertion, depleting her supply faster than planned. When she rejoined the line, the margin she had started with was already gone. I think that was the moment this story effectively ended, even if no one recognized it for another few hours. The southeast ridge at 28,000 feet is a narrow spine of wind-packed snow and exposed rock, with open sky pressing in from both sides and nothing to interrupt either the wind or the cold. On descent, the congestion worsened. A German climber positioned directly behind her, and her Sherpa both described her stopping repeatedly, not to rest, but to film, holding her phone toward other struggling climbers and removing her mask to speak into the frame. According to witnesses, her movements were still coordinated but slower and less precise than earlier. Then, near 27,500 feet, her pace dropped noticeably. She struggled to reclip her safety tether, fumbling the mechanism several times before it caught as her hands hesitated at the gate. The German climber heard her speak through the mask, and later told investigators he couldn't parse any of it. She removed her mask again to narrate. When she tried to reseat it, she couldn't manage the fit on the first 2 attempts, as the mask shifted against her face, covering and stiffened straps. Her Sherpa reached her and found ice forming along the valve and hose, with airflow becoming inconsistent under her breathing. The oxygen tank was nearly depleted. He tried to direct her toward descent. She continued holding the phone up, though the footage was brief and unsteady. The German climber watched the exchange while clipped in place with the line held tight, unable to move forward in the queue. I don't think she understood what was happening to her body, and I don't think anyone could have told her in a way that would have mattered. Then she went to her knees. Her hands became rigid, fingers curled and unresponsive. She was partially moved off the fixed line to clear passage for other climbers. Not a decision made lightly, but one that couldn't wait. Her phone was still loosely in her grip. A descending climber offered supplemental oxygen from his own supply. It was administered briefly but couldn't be spared beyond a few minutes. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. The Sherpa attempted repeatedly to rouse her. She no longer responded to commands or physical contact. The Sherpa radioed down at approximately 7:40 a.m. Supplemental oxygen was requested, but delayed by congestion on the fixed lines. Help reached her position well over an hour later, after slow movement through the line. She was already dead. Medical findings summarized for the expedition record indicated severe hypoxia leading to loss of consciousness at extreme altitude. Her short-form video account was accessed by family after contacting the platform for account control and quietly deactivated within weeks, with most. Public content removed from view. The equipment worked. The weather held. What failed was the distance between what she believed her experience had prepared her for and what the mountain actually required. It was May 6, 2019, and Everest Base Camp sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier in the familiar chaos of spring. Hundreds of tents clustered by Expedition Company, separated by ridges of gray moraine and runnels of glacial melt. The temperature hovered near 30 degrees Fahrenheit under thin overcast. From everything I've gathered, it was mild enough that climbers moved between tents without down jackets, their breath still visible at 17,600 feet. Prayer flags stretched between rock cairns, snapping when gusts funneled through the valley. The 2019 season was shaping up to be the busiest in Everest's history. Nepal had issued a record number of climbing permits, and the result was visible everywhere. More tents, more companies, more clients than the mountain's narrow upper routes could absorb. When weather windows compressed the available summit days, the math became dangerous. Too many people on too little terrain, all burning oxygen while waiting in lines that moved at the pace of the slowest climber. Among the hundreds of climbers staged at base camp was Kira Callister, a 26-year-old content creator from Austin, Texas. Kira had built a TikTok following of roughly 400,000 on a formula that required constant escalation. Short-form clips of bungee jumps, skydives, shark cage dives, and cliff jumps, each framed around the concept of conquering fear. Her audience expected each stunt to exceed the last, and the algorithm rewarded the pattern with reach that kept climbing as long as the stakes did. Everest was the logical next step in that arc. Kira had completed a guided ascent of Kilimanjaro the previous year and attempted Aconcagua 6 months before arriving in Nepal. The Aconcagua attempt ended at Camp 2 when weather forced a retreat, though her content reframed the outcome as a strategic decision. "The mountain wasn't ready for me yet," she told her followers in a post that collected hundreds of thousands of views. The reality was simpler. She had been told to turn around by her guide and had no choice in the matter. But the narrative she built around it suggested agency and fearlessness, and her audience accepted it without question. I kept coming back to this. A single Kilimanjaro trek and an Aconcagua turnaround. That was the entire resume she brought to the highest mountain on Earth. She had paid approximately $65,000 to join a commercial expedition operated by a mid-tier company based in Kathmandu. Part of that cost was offset by 2 brand partnerships, an outdoor apparel company and an energy supplement brand, both conditional on summit content. The arrangement meant Kira's presence on Everest was not purely personal ambition. It was a deliverable. Alongside standard climbing equipment, Kira carried 2 action cameras, a compact gimbal stabilizer, and a portable battery bank that weighed nearly as much as the extra oxygen bottle it displaced in her pack. Her pre-expedition content had promised followers a series she called Summit or Die Trying, a phrase her audience interpreted as motivational rhetoric, though it carried a literalness Kira did not seem to appreciate. I need you to remember that phrase. The Sherpa assigned to guide Kira through the upper mountain was Panuru Kitup, a 41-year-old from Tame Village in the Khumbu Valley. Panuru had summited Everest 14 times across 17 seasons, a record built not on ambition, but on the economic reality that high-altitude guiding was the most reliable income available to men from his region. He had learned climbing from an uncle who guided in the early commercial era of the 1990s. His father had been a farmer who never ventured above base camp and regarded the mountain with a respect that bordered on fear. Panuru supported his mother, his wife, and 3 school-aged children on what he earned during the climbing season, supplemented by occasional trekking work in the autumn. Honestly, when I found out how many seasons this man had under his belt, 17 years of reading clients, reading weather, reading the mountain, it made what comes next that much harder to sit with. Within the Sherpa guiding network, Panuru was known for patience. He absorbed difficult client personalities, the nervous, the arrogant, the demanding, without visible frustration, redirecting behavior through calm repetition rather than confrontation. Companies assigned him to clients they identified as potential liabilities. His assignment to Kira was not random. From what I found, the expedition company had reviewed Kira's social media presence before the season and recognized the combination of limited experience and high self-regard that created the most management-intensive clients. The problems began during the first acclimatization rotation through the Khumbu Icefall, the most dangerous section of the climb, a fractured cascade of ice blocks and crevasses that shifted and collapsed without warning. Standard practice was to move through quickly, minimizing time beneath seracs that could calve at any moment. Kira treated the icefall as a set. She stopped at choke points to position her camera while Sherpas carrying 60-pound loads waited behind her beneath overhanging ice towers. Panuru explained the danger during a rest between ladder crossings. Kira acknowledged the concern, adjusted for 20 minutes, then resumed filming at the next dramatic section. The footage appeared on her account that evening, captioned as navigating the most dangerous terrain on Earth, the people she had forced to wait beneath it. And this is where the pattern starts. She heard the warning, performed the adjustment, and went right back to doing exactly what she was told not to do. Panuru reported the behavior to the expedition leader after returning to base camp. The response acknowledged the concern, but noted that filming was common among clients and that Kira had not violated any contractual terms. The company would remind her about safety protocols. That right there is what frustrates me about how these operations work. The guide raises the flag, and the system files it away. The second incident occurred during a rest day at Camp 2. Kira asked Panuru to walk past the camera carrying a load of equipment so she could film the shot and narrate over it. Panuru declined. Kira was visibly irritated but moved on. She spent the next hour filming other Sherpas carrying loads and preparing meals, without their knowledge or consent. The footage appeared in a TikTok with a text overlay describing the invisible army that makes Everest possible. The phrase sounded respectful in isolation. In practice, it turned working men into background content. Several Sherpas saw the video through clients' phones. The way I read that, the phrase invisible army tells you everything about how she saw them, not as individuals, as scenery. During the acclimatization rotation to Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, Kira created a different kind of problem. The face was a wall of blue ice rising roughly 3,700 vertical feet, with fixed ropes its entire length. The terrain was steep enough that stopping meant blocking everyone above and below, and the exposure was severe. Kira stopped repeatedly at anchor stations to set up her camera, filming herself climbing up toward it from below, holding position at each anchor for minutes while she reviewed footage and adjusted angles. Each stop forced Sherpas carrying loads to hang on the fixed ropes in exposed positions, unable to pass until she cleared the anchor. Panuru warned her the behavior endangered others and wasted energy she would need later. Kira adjusted briefly, then resumed when Panuru's attention was elsewhere. And based on what I found, this wasn't just reckless. Every minute those Sherpas spent hanging on that face waiting for her was a minute of exposure to the same terrain that kills more Sherpas than any other section of the mountain. The fourth incident was quieter, but carried more weight. During a rest day at Camp 2, Kira sat in the mess tent discussing content strategy with another client. Several Sherpas present understood enough English to follow. She described how the Everest series had already gained her 80,000 new followers and predicted summit footage could reach millions. She talked about sponsorship deals with an enthusiasm that revealed something the Sherpas recognized immediately. The mountain did not exist for her as a place with its own, a significance. It was infrastructure for content. Everything was metrics. That part honestly sat heavy with me. Not because ambition is unusual on Everest, but because there wasn't a single moment where the mountain was anything more than a backdrop to her. The summit window opened around May 22nd. Teams began staging upward. The expedition leader briefed all clients. Turnaround time was noon. If a climber had not summited by 12 o'clock, they turned around regardless of proximity. Kira agreed to the terms. That evening, other climbers noticed her checking camera batteries and memory cards with the same attention they devoted to oxygen regulators. Stay with me here, because from this point forward, the clock is driving everything. Kira and Panuru departed Camp 4 on the South Col at approximately 12:30 a.m. on May 25th, accompanied by Panuru's assistant Sherpa, who carried backup oxygen and monitored supply levels. They joined a line of headlamps stretching up the triangular face toward the balcony, each light marking a climber moving upward through darkness at a pace dictated by air that held barely a third of its sea-level oxygen. Kira climbed adequately but slowly. She stopped more frequently than anyone around her, sometimes to catch her breath, sometimes to film. Each filming stop cost 2 to 5 minutes. Individually, none were significant. Collectively, they bled time that could not be recovered. Panuru managed each stop patiently, giving Kira a moment before urging her forward. At the balcony, a small platform at 27,600 feet, where teams paused to change oxygen bottles, Kira used the stop to film a sunrise sequence. She pulled her oxygen mask down repeatedly across multiple takes, delivering audio directly to camera as the light changed. On, off, adjust the angle, off again. The cumulative time without supplemental oxygen approached 10 minutes. At that altitude, every unmasked minute inflicted measurable damage. Brain, cells starving in quantities that would never regenerate. Cognitive function degrading in ways the climber could not perceive in real time. Panuru told her to keep the mask on. Kira completed one more take before complying. They left the balcony behind schedule. I've covered enough of these to know that 10 minutes without oxygen at 27,600 feet doesn't show up immediately. It collects, and it collects interest. The queue at the Hillary Step cost them another 40 minutes. The 2019 season's record numbers had created exactly the bottleneck veteran guides feared. Climbers lined up at nearly 29,000 feet, each burning through oxygen while waiting. Kira filmed the line, narrating about the famous bottleneck where climbers die. Panuru watched the time, with a concern that nearby climbers later recalled. And while she was narrating about the people who died in that line, she was standing in the same line, burning the same oxygen, making the same mistake she was describing. Kira. Callister reached the summit of Mount Everest at 12:47 p.m. on May 25th, 2019, 47 minutes past turnaround. At noon, Kira had been roughly 30 minutes below the summit, close enough that Panuru could see climbers on the summit ridge above. He radioed the expedition leader and reported their position. The response left the decision to Panuru's judgment. The company would not order a mandatory turnaround with the summit in sight. Panuru made the call to continue, a calculation experienced guides made regularly when clients were close and conditions remained stable. But the late arrival meant every second on top was borrowed from the descent margin that kept climbers alive. Panuru communicated this immediately. They needed to take photos and leave. Kira began filming. She recorded a video message to her followers, removing her oxygen mask for a clean face shot. She recorded a panoramic sweep. She asked Panuru to film her from a specific angle. Panuru complied once, then told her they were leaving. The assistant Sherpa, monitoring oxygen gauges, confirmed what Panuru already knew. Every minute on the summit was consuming supply they could not afford. Kira asked for 5 more minutes, then another 5. She wanted a shot with a flag, then another angle with a different camera. She became agitated when Panuru insisted they needed to descend. They left the summit at 1:31 p.m., 44 minutes after arrival. Kira had spent extended periods without her oxygen mask at 29,029 feet, the highest point on Earth, filming content for an audience that would never understand what those minutes cost her body. 44 minutes. I need you to let that land. Every protocol said 15. She tripled it. For content. The descent from the Hillary Step was slow. Climbers still ascending created bottlenecks on the fixed ropes. Every minute standing still at extreme altitude consumed oxygen and energy that could not be replaced. Below the south summit, around 2:30 p.m., Kira's deterioration became visible. Her pace slowed. Her crampon placements, which had been adequate on the ascent, became imprecise, scraping against rock before finding purchase, each step requiring correction that a fresh climber would not have needed. Her rest stops grew longer. Panuru recognized the pattern. The cumulative hypoxic damage from filming without her mask, nearly 10 minutes at the balcony, extended periods on the summit, was expressing itself in ways supplemental oxygen could not repair. Separately, the assistant Sherpa checked oxygen supply and found consumption running higher than planned. The extended summit stay and slow descent pace were burning through reserves faster than the schedule allowed, enough to reach Camp 4, but the margin had thinned to almost nothing. Two distinct problems were converging. Kira's body was failing in ways her remaining oxygen could not fix, and the oxygen itself was running shorter than planned. And I wish I could say this is where things turn around, but bear with me. It only gets worse from here. By 3 p.m., the wind had picked up, pushing in from the northwest with the predictable afternoon deterioration. Visibility dropped slightly. The temperature fell further. At approximately 27,000 feet around 3:30 p.m., Kira stopped and sat down on the snow. She told Panuru she needed to rest. Panuru urged her to keep moving. At this altitude, stopping accelerated the decline that was already underway. The body cooled, muscles stiffened, and the will to resume movement eroded with every stationary minute. Kira rested for several minutes before standing, but when she resumed, her pace had dropped to roughly half what it had been. At approximately 26,600 feet, around 4:15 p.m., Kira collapsed. Her legs simply stopped supporting her weight, and she sank to her knees. She did not attempt to stand. Panuru and his assistant reached her within seconds. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, each inhalation producing minimal effect, despite the oxygen flowing through her mask. Her responses to questions arrived late and slurred, words falling apart in ways that indicated her brain was no longer processing at functional speed. Both Sherpas attempted to get her moving. They positioned themselves on either side, supporting her weight, and managed to move her roughly 200 feet over 20 minutes. But Kira was not assisting her own movement. Her legs made occasional motions resembling steps, but contributed almost nothing to forward progress. At that altitude, dragging an incapacitated climber was physically unsustainable. Both Sherpas' own oxygen consumption spiked under the exertion, their muscles burning through reserves they needed for their own survival. Panuru radioed the expedition leader at Camp 4. The conversation was brief. There was no rescue capacity at that altitude. No helicopter could operate above 26,000 feet. Assembling a carry team from Camp 4 would require hours that did not exist, and the Sherpas who attempted it would be placing their own lives at extreme risk. The response came back clearly. If the client could not move under her own power, the Sherpas needed to descend to save themselves. That right there is the part that gets me about these situations. The math is already done. Everyone on that radio knows the answer, but saying it out loud is something else entirely. Panuru did not leave. He and his assistant spent roughly another 45 minutes trying to revive Kira, adjusting oxygen flow, forcing water between her lips, lifting her to her feet, where she stood for seconds before collapsing again. During these attempts, Panuru removed his outer mitts to manipulate Kira's oxygen regulator with greater dexterity. The valves were small, the connections precise, and the work required fine motor control that expedition mittens could not provide. He worked in thin liner gloves that offered almost no thermal protection, fingers manipulating frozen metal while wind cut across the slope. And this is the detail I keep coming back to. He'd already been told to leave. The radio gave him permission to save himself. Instead, he spent 45 more minutes on his knees in the wind, working a frozen regulator in liner gloves, trying to save someone who wouldn't be on that mountain if it weren't for a content calendar. By 5:15 p.m., Kira had stopped responding entirely. Her eyes remained open but tracked nothing. Her breathing had become irregular, shallow gasps, separated by pauses that lengthened each time. Panuru recognized the pattern. He had seen it before on previous expeditions, in other climbers whose bodies had crossed the threshold beyond which recovery at that altitude was no longer possible. Panuru and his assistant had been above 26,000 feet for over 17 hours. Their own oxygen was depleting. Panuru's hands had lost all sensation. The liner gloves had provided almost no barrier during the extended work on the regulator, and the cold had penetrated deep into the tissue. His assistant was showing early signs of fatigue, his movements carrying the careful deliberateness of someone managing diminishing reserves. Darkness was approaching. Panuru made the decision. They arranged Kira as best they could, propped against a rock feature that offered partial shelter from the wind, oxygen still flowing on what remained in the bottle, face shielded from the direct blast. Panuru placed an emergency blanket over her. The wind began pulling at it immediately, the thin material snapping against rock. There was nothing else to be done. And I think no matter how many of these stories I cover, that specific moment where a guide has to turn his back on someone who's still breathing is the one I can never sit with comfortably. They clipped into the fixed rope and began descending. Panuru did not look back. A climber from another team, descending ahead of them, later recalled seeing the two Sherpas emerge from from the gathering darkness. Panuru, moving with a steadiness that concealed whatever was happening inside him, his assistant close behind, both focused entirely on the mechanics of getting themselves down alive. They reached Camp 4 after dark, approximately 7:30 p.m. Panuru's hands were severely frostbitten, the skin white and waxy beneath the liners, the fingers swollen and rigid, sensation gone from the tips to the second knuckle. He did not mention the injury. It was noticed by another Sherpa who saw him struggling to unclip from the fixed rope with hands that would not close around the carabiner gate. Kira Callister was not found alive. A team ascending early the following morning passed her position and confirmed she was no longer breathing. Her body remained where Panuru had left her, the emergency blanket torn away by wind sometime during the night. Her phone was recovered weeks later by Sherpas from the same expedition company who retrieved personal effects while passing her position during subsequent summit support rotations. The phone contained drafted TikTok posts that had never been uploaded, summit content with captions already written, formatted, and ready to publish the moment she reached cellular signal at base camp. One draft included the phrase summit or die trying in the caption. The last photo in the camera roll was a summit shot time-stamped 1:28 p.m. Kira smiling, mask pulled down, the Himalayan panorama sharp behind her, 3 minutes before Panuru finally convinced her to begin descending. That detail stays with me more than almost anything else in this story. The posts were ready, the captions were written. She'd even used the phrase, and the mountain took her at her word. The investigation by Nepalese authorities concluded that Kira's death resulted from exhaustion and hypoxia caused by extended exposure at extreme altitude. No fault was assigned to the Sherpa team. Panuru and his assistants' efforts to revive their client were documented through radio logs and corroborated by witness statements from climbers who observed the attempts from nearby positions on the descent route. Panuru Kaitup was evacuated to Kathmandu for treatment of severe frostbite sustained while trying to save his client at 26,600 feet. He lost 2 fingers on his right hand and partial tissue on 3 fingers of his left, damage from working an oxygen regulator and liner gloves in wind at an altitude where exposed skin froze within minutes. The injuries ended his career as a high-altitude guide. The precision grip required for rope work, ice screw placement, and the regulator adjustments that had cost him his fingers was no longer possible. After 17 seasons on Everest, 14 summits, countless clients guided safely through the death zone, his final act at extreme altitude was spending an hour trying to keep alive a woman who had treated the climb as content. Panuru returned to Tem Village. The expedition company quietly updated its client screening procedures, and to me, that's the part that never gets talked about. The mountain doesn't just take the ones who die, it takes the careers of the ones who tried to save them.
It was May 16th, 2019, and the wind was screaming across the upper slopes of Mount Everest in the death zone air above 26,000 feet. The death zone is what climbers call everything above that line, where there is so little oxygen that the body is quietly dying every hour it stays, unable to truly rest or recover until it goes back down. Almost no one climbs that high without bottled oxygen and a mask, and almost no one climbs it without a team of Sherpas, the elite high-altitude mountaineers who fix the ropes, haul the loads, manage the gas, and turn one of the deadliest places on Earth into something a paying client might survive. On that day, high on the ridge between the South Summit and the very top of the world, one of those Sherpas was being asked again to back up and get a wider shot. The client he was filming was named Aveline Hartley, and back home she was not a climber, she was a creator. 28 years old, a full-time travel and adventure influencer with an enormous following and a brand built almost entirely on the image of a fearless young woman doing beautiful, daring things in far-off places. She made her living on motion and color and nerve, on being the person her audience wished they were brave enough to be, and Everest was meant to be the crown on all of it. Not a mountain so much as the ultimate piece of content, the post that would dwarf everything before it and carry her from popular to untouchable. She had teased the trip to her followers for months, and she had come up the mountain with a very precise idea of the footage she needed to bring home. And this is the thing you have to understand about how she saw the whole expedition, because it explains almost everything that came after. To a real mountaineer, Everest is a deadly serious thing, earned over many years of smaller, harder climbs. To Aveline, somewhere underneath it all, it was a shoot, a location, the most expensive and most dangerous set she had ever booked, staffed with the best crew money could hire, with a shot list in her head that mattered to her. In the moment, more than almost anything else up there. I honestly cannot even fathom why she treated the best climbers alive as a tripod instead of as a guide who could save her. She was not some clueless tourist who had wandered onto the mountain by accident. She was fit, truly fit, with a few guided summits already behind her, smaller peaks where heavy support and kind weather had carried her to the top and handed her the highlight reels that built her audience in the first place. She knew how to suffer a little for a shot. She was not helpless, and she was not lazy, but there is a wide gap between being fit enough to be led up a mountain and being wise enough to survive one, and that gap is filled by exactly the judgment she had spent her whole climbing life handing to other people while she pointed a camera at herself. She had always had a guide to keep her alive, which meant she had never once had to learn in her own body how close to the edge she really was, or how fast the cost of a mistake comes due up high. For years, I've seen creators like her, and I always see the same pattern of the camera becoming more important than ever, even their own safety. And the pattern was there long before summit day for anyone who cared to look. In the weeks the team spent acclimatizing, moving up and down the mountain in stages through the groaning maze of the Khumbu icefall and the high camps, letting their bodies slowly adjust to the thin air, Aveline was filming all of it. The ladders lashed over the deep crevasses were a set piece. The tents at Camp 2 were a backdrop. On one of those climbs, she had even unclipped from a fixed line to get a cleaner shot on ground where a single slip would have ended her. And when Dawa clipped her back in and gently explained why, she had thanked him warmly and asked if they could do it one more time. He watched her treat some of the most dangerous ground on the planet as a series of locations, and he understood early that the camera was going to be the hardest thing he managed on this mountain. The man leading her Sherpa team was named Dawa Gyaltsen. He was 41, born in the Khumbu within sight of the peaks he had spent his life climbing, and he had stood on the summit of Everest more times than most people will ever climb anything at all. He had turned clients back in good weather and bad. He had carried sick and broken people down off that mountain on his own back. He had learned to read the snow and the sky and the human body with the kind of quiet precision that only comes from a lifetime of staying alive in a place that kills the careless without a second thought. Working under him was a young Sherpa named Nima, just 24, strong and eager, and still early in a career he hoped would one day look like Dawa's. He was there to learn, to carry, to help, to do whatever the climb and the client needed. And from nearly the first day, Aveline looked at these two men, two of the most capable human beings on the entire mountain, and saw, more than anything else, two extra sets of hands to run her cameras. Picture this. A man who has summited Everest more times than I can count, reduced to holding her phone and filming. She never really understood what she was looking at. Standing right beside her were decades of hard, specific knowledge about the exact mountain that was about to try to kill her, and she mostly used it to get better angles. Dawa was her director of photography. Nima was her second camera. The fact that they were, between them, worth more on that mountain than any piece of gear she owned barely registered. Because in the world, she came from the most important person on any set is always the talent, and the talent was her. Dawa had worked with hard clients before, and he had a way of doing his job that did not depend on them respecting him. He watched. He managed, he tried, constantly, to steer. But Aveline was a stranger kind of difficult, because she was not rude to him. She was something harder to push back against. She was warm and friendly and completely, cheerfully deaf. When he spoke about pace, or timing, or exactly where to place her feet, she would nod and smile and thank him, and then ask him to grab a different angle. There was also a weight on her that the mountain could not see and would never care about. She had promised this summit to a great many people. She had built the entire story of it for her audience. The training montages, the gear, the journey in, the countdown, and somewhere in all that promising, she had quietly made it almost unthinkable to come home without the ending she had sold them. Turning back, even for the best reason in the world, would not feel like wisdom to her up there. It would feel like letting down every single person who was watching and waiting. I'd never put myself in this situation to begin with, but when you promise millions of fans a summit, I think turning back feels like failing them, even if it can save your life. On the evening of May 15th, the team rested at the South Col, the last camp before the summit, a barren, wind-scoured saddle of ice and rock sitting right at the lower edge of the death zone. It is not a place anyone lingers. A little before 10 that night, into a hard wind and a black sky thick with stars, headlamps clicking on one by one across the camp, they clipped into the fixed line and started up toward the top. Climbing through the night up there is a brutal, narrow thing. The whole world shrinks to the small circle of a headlamp beam and the boots moving in front of you. The cold finds every gap in your clothing and pushes well past 40 degrees below zero in the wind. And the bottled oxygen flowing softly under your mask is the one thin thread holding your brain and your fingers and your judgment together. It is the kind of place that demands every scrap of focus a person has. Aveline wanted to document all of it. Climbing into that cold and dark would scare most of us, but to hear it was just another scenery to film. She was also not alone up there, not even close. On a good, clear morning in the short climbing season, the route to the summit fills with people, a slow line of climbers all clipped to the same fixed ropes, moving at the speed of the slowest among them. To a careful climber, that crowd is one more hazard, a source of delay on a route where delay is what kills you. To Aveline, the other climbers were mostly scenery, extras in the wide shots, and the bottlenecks where the line bunched up and stalled were just more time she did not believe she needed to worry about. And so, again and again on the way up, she would stop, pull the oxygen mask down off her face, push her goggles up onto her forehead so the camera could see her eyes clearly, and deliver a breathless little piece about how completely unreal all of this was. Each time she did it, she was cutting off her own oxygen supply at the exact altitude where that matters most, and baring the skin of her face and her eyes to a cold that can do permanent damage in a matter of minutes. To her, it was nothing. A few seconds with the mask off to grab a clean shot, the sort of thing you do 100 times on a normal shoot without a single thought. But up there, nothing is free. Every one of those tidy little clips quietly cost her a sliver of the clear thinking she was going to need so badly later, and she had no way at all to feel it leaving, because clear thinking is the very first thing the altitude quietly takes from you. Every time she dropped that mask, I winced, because she was trading a clear head for mere seconds of footage. The oxygen was only the beginning of it. As the sun finally came up and the camera could take in the staggering, curved world stretching out around her, Aveline became fixated on how the footage actually looked, and the thing that kept ruining the look in her eyes was the safety equipment. The fixed rope runs through the middle of every single frame, the bulky carabiner clipped to the front of her harness, catching the light. The whole entire point of those ropes is that they are the one thing tying a climber to the mountain on ground where a single slip is instantly fatal. But they are also undeniably ugly on camera. So she started unclipping for the hero shots, stepping off the line so the footage would look clean and free and pure, just her and the mountain and the enormous sky, nothing as unglamorous as a rope to spoil the frame. Dawa would clip her back in, and a little while later she would quietly do it again. Unclipping from the rope keeping you alive for a cleaner shot is the most dangerous thing I can imagine. The cold up there is not like cold at any normal elevation. It is an active hunting thing, and it goes straight for the parts of you that are exposed and the parts that are not getting enough blood. Every time Aveline peeled off a glove to work her phone, every time she dropped the mask to talk to the lens, she was handing the cold an opening, and it took every single one. Her fingertips had gone past pain into a bad, waxy numbness. The skin on her cheeks and her nose, bared over and over for the camera, was slowly freezing. And almost none of it hurt the way it should have, because the altitude had dulled even that warning, so she simply kept on filming. This was the rhythm of the whole climb, and it never once broke. Dawa would hand her real information, the kind that keeps people breathing, and Aveline would receive it as a suggestion from the crew. He told her to keep the mask on, and she filmed another clip. He told her to stay clipped in, and she stepped out of the line for an angle. He told her she was moving too slowly for the time on the clock, and she asked him to film that last section over again, because the light had been just a little better the first time. After all the videos I've done and researched on this channel, I just want to reach into that screen and tell her the mountain does not do second takes. And up high, oxygen is not just comfort, it is time and warmth and clear thinking all bound together in metal cylinders, and there is only ever so much of it. Every climber on that mountain is quietly running a careful sum in their head. How much gas is on their back, how fast it is flowing, how long it has to last to get them up, and, far more importantly, all the way back down. The math is quiet and merciless, and it does not forgive a single minute spent the wrong way. Every extra minute Aveline burned on a shot was gas she would not have later on the descent, when she would need it the most. She was spending the back half of her own climb to pay for the front half's footage, and she had no idea she was doing it. And the reshoots were the worst of all of it, because they did not only cost her safety, they cost her time. And time is the one currency on a summit day that you simply cannot borrow against. A summit push is a race against a closing window. You climb through the night precisely so you can reach the top early in the morning and get yourself back down to safety before the afternoon weather builds and the day turns hard against you. Every single minute matters. Aveline spent her minutes like a woman with an endless supply of them. She stopped to redo pieces to camera. She sent Nima scrambling ahead up the slope to film her climbing up toward the lens. She did short sections of the route twice because the first take had been shaky or blocked by another climber, or just not quite right. And while Dawa watched the clock and the sky with a slowly tightening dread, she ran the single most dangerous day of her life like a relaxed afternoon on a set back home. Dawa kept warning her how late they were, and it pains me how she just kept ignoring it. At this point, it probably didn't even register that the one warning her was one of the best climbers alive. In her head, she was running a schedule, and a schedule is a soft and forgiving thing. Something you can shuffle and push and promise to make up later. The mountain was running a clock, a hard one. It was ticking down, minute by minute, to the exact moment the weather and the thin air and the deep cold would turn from merely deadly to certainly so. And it did not care in the slightest about her light or her angles or her shot list. Those two clocks were never going to agree, and only one of them ever had a vote that actually counted around her. The mountain was already telling the story plainly. Other climbers who had summited earlier that morning, back in the safer light of dawn, were filing down past her now, spent and quiet and done for the day. Whole teams had read the same clock Dawa was reading and turned for home while they still had the margin to make it back alive. Aveline watched them pass and saw only foot traffic cluttering her shots, never once registering that every single one of them was doing the exact thing she refused to do. There is a thing in high mountaineering called a turnaround time. It is a hard hour, decided Inad Hartley, in the calm and the safety of camp. And the rule attached to it is simple and completely unforgiving. If you are not standing on the summit by that hour, you turn around, no matter how close you are, no matter how good you feel, because the mountain on the way down is far deadlier than it ever was on the way up. Somewhere on that upper ridge, well past their turnaround time, Dawa told Aveline plainly that they were too late, that the only safe and sane thing left to do was to turn around right there and start down. But she could see the top. It was right there. And she told him, in so many words, that she had not climbed all this way and promised all those people only to turn back without her shot. He could not physically force a grown client down a mountain against her will, so they kept going up. There is a hard deadline to turn back or you will genuinely lose your life, and it hurts me that she ignored it for a single photo. It is one of the cruel, unchangeable facts of Everest that most of the people who die on it die on the way down, not on the way up. They pour everything they have into reaching the top, and then they have to do the hardest, most dangerous part of the entire climb while exhausted, low on oxygen, and running out of daylight. A late summit is not a small triumph that costs a little extra. It is a loan taken out against the most dangerous hours of the day. And by the time Aveline was nearing the top, she had borrowed heavily, her oxygen low, her judgment thinned to almost nothing by hours of cold and altitude. The safe hours already behind her, and still the only thing in her mind was how close she now was to the shot. The last stretch to the very top of Everest runs along a knife-edge ridge that is, with no exaggeration whatsoever, one of the most exposed places a human being can stand on this planet. On one side, the mountain falls away thousands upon thousands of feet down the southwest face into Nepal. On the other, it drops even farther down the Kangshung face into Tibet. The ridge threading between those two enormous voids narrows in places to barely the width of a tabletop, with a wind that wants nothing more than to shove you off of it. People have died right there doing nothing more reckless than pausing in the wrong spot, simply worn thin and a half-step careless at the tail end of a very long climb. And worse, much of that ridge is corniced. That means the snow does not stop where the solid rock stops underneath it. It curls out past the true edge into a frozen, overhanging lip with nothing but thousands of feet of empty air beneath it, ground that looks perfectly solid and safe from above and is, in fact, not ground at all. Climbers with real experience treat that ridge with something very close to reverence. Evelyn crossed it thinking about her shot. It amazes me that the most famous summit on Earth is just a thin shelf of snow over a deadly fall. The final approach took them up and over the famous step just below the summit, a short, awkward rise that nearly every climber who has ever read about Everest knows by name, and then out onto the last narrow run of cornice snow leading toward the top. By now, the morning was long gone, and the day was wearing on into exactly the hours the turnaround rule exists to keep people away from. Each step was slow and heavy and starved of air. Dawa stayed right at her shoulder, watching her feet, watching the snow, watching the sky begin its slow afternoon change, doing the only useful thing he had left, which was trying to keep her alive through a descent he was already quietly dreading. And there was Nima, 24 years old, carrying a camera he had been told never to lower. In the world Aveline came from, holding the camera is the junior job. In the world Nima came from, the wishes of the client who has paid for everything carry a weight that is hard to explain to anyone who has never depended on that work to feed a whole family. He was strong enough and skilled enough to be standing where he stood. He was not in any position to argue with her. And she had given him one very clear, very simple instruction to keep filming, no matter what happened, until she told him to stop. And then, in the early afternoon, far later than they ever should have, they were there, the summit of Mount Everest. The actual top of the world, the highest point on the entire surface of the planet, and the thing that quietly stuns almost everyone who finally reaches it is just how small it really is. A modest dome of snow not much larger than a dining table, fringed at its edges by those same treacherous cornices, ringed on every side by a fall so vast and so complete that the mind cannot really hold it. No railing, no margin for error, just a tiny patch of safe snow, a staggering view in every direction, and a very long way down everywhere a person is not supposed to step. I can feel the danger here, because she is focused on her framing, while Dawa is focused on her feet. For Aveline, standing up there at last, almost none of that danger seemed to land. What landed was that she had made it, that the impossible piece of content was finally, actually hers, that everything she had promised her audience for months was about to be delivered in full. She was elated, nearly giddy with it, running on adrenaline and thin air and the absolute certainty that this, right here, was the moment everything had been for. She pulled out her phone, pressed it into young Nima's thick gloved hands, and told him to film, to keep filming, to get all of it, and not to stop until she said so. And Nima, far down the chain of command from the woman who had paid for everything, did exactly as he was told, raised the camera, and started to record. Watching her hand that young man her phone and perform on that summit is where I had to stop and just breathe. Because she did next, she did entirely for the camera, because by now the camera was the only thing she was really climbing for. She began to celebrate for the lens, the same way she had celebrated on every smaller summit that had ever built her following. Arms thrown wide to the sky, a slow turn to take in the whole curved world around her, playing the moment up big for all the people who would watch it later. On safe, flat ground, it would have made a genuinely lovely clip. On the tiny cornice dome at the very top of Everest, with her judgment already hollowed out by hours of thin air, it was a performance staged on the most dangerous few square feet on Earth. And then she wanted the big one, the wide shot, the frame with the entire impossible drop spread out huge behind her. So she told Nima to make sure he was getting all of it, and she started stepping backward, edging toward the lip of the ridge to fit the whole staggering view into the space between herself and the lens. Dawa saw what was happening and started shouting, calling her name, telling her to stop, to come back toward him, that the edge was not where she thought it was. She heard a crew member fussing over a shot, and she took one more step back to get it. Each step backward she took for the shot is one I wanted to scream at. The snow behind her was air. The snow she stepped back onto was not snow resting on solid rock. It was the cornice, the overhanging lip, curling out over thousands of feet of pure nothing, and it could not hold her weight. It gave way beneath her without a sound, and she dropped through it and was gone over the edge in far less than a second, down the enormous face of the mountain. And there was nothing at all on that narrow ridge that anyone, even Dawa, could have done to reach her in time. And Nima was still recording, because she had told him not to stop. And so the camera she had pressed into his hands a few minutes earlier caught the entire thing, the last moment of the trip she had built her whole life around. I will never shake the image of that young man being told to keep filming and then having no other option but to keep doing it. Which on a day like that one is its own quiet miracle, and radioed down what had happened to the team waiting below. The expedition operator notified the local authorities and, eventually, Aveline's family, and the slow, grim reality of a death in that place settled in, the part the highlight reels never show. A body that falls down that face in that spot is very often something that simply cannot be recovered at all. And so the mountain she had treated as a backdrop kept her, the way it has quietly kept so many others who mistook it for a set. To me, the cruelest part is that the footage survived and she did not, when being seen was her dream. She had come to Everest to be seen, and in the cruelest way imaginable, she got her wish, because that footage is the one thing that outlived her. She had been handed two of the finest mountaineers alive, men who could read that mountain like a language, and tried the whole way up to tell her what it was saying. And she turned them into a film crew, and herself into the only thing worth pointing a camera at. Every rope she stepped away from, every warning she waved off, every minute spent on the shot instead of the climb was a small trade of her life for her audience. On that last step backward, the trade came due. The people who could have saved her were right there the whole time. She had simply decided they were only there to watch. It saddens me that she turned the only people who could have saved her into an audience. Just imagining them filming her fall and not being able to do anything, it absolutely breaks my heart.